speaking to Cormac as a team really reinforced to us the vital role that our members play in building local communities and bringing people together. When I met Cormac in May, he presented the Discovering ABC series via video conference, and I would really encourage any of you who've not watched any of those series to do that. I know that a lot of the people who tendered for the Empowering Communities program tended to watch them, and it gave them a lot of inspiration. You just get, there's a whole series of them now. We've had Peter Kenyon, Cormac. It's a really fantastic resource. So after he'd run the session on Discovering ABCD, I said to Cormac, well, you know, we've got video conferencing, Cormac. We might be able to beam you in live from Ireland to Perth. And he thought, he was pretty keen on that. And I said, but you may be in your pajamas because of the time difference. So I don't know whether he's going to be in his PJs today or not, or whether he's going to be like a newsreader, and I won't ask. So we've also got the technology today provided by Jerry Murphy from being there, and obviously helped by Pam, and the presentation by Cormac. So I'm hoping we've got the luck and the brilliance of the Irish, and this is all going to come together and work. Cormac is passionate about community and brings his heart and, again, very beautiful stories about community building. So I'd like you to sit back and enjoy Cormac's keynote. Are we ready to go? No. Okay. So we're running a little bit early, so it might be that Cormac is, there he is. Hi, Cormac.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jane. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you, Cormac?
Great. Good to be with you.
Excellent.
I'm not in my PJ.
Oh, you're not? Okay, so Cormac, I understand. I've introduced you, Cormac. I don't know if you heard that.
We're good to go.
Okay, you're good to go.
Great.
So I'm going to hand over to you,
Wonderful.
Cormac.
Thanks so much, Jane. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a real privilege to be with you. So what I thought I'd do this morning is to share with you some reflections from around the world about why I think the role that you play is so important. And just to say that a lot of what I'll be sharing is not just from outside of Australia. It's from about 35 different countries, inclusive of our experience in Australia as well. But before I share, I just want to set the scene a little, and then I'm going to ask for 3 volunteers who are kind enough to just say a little bit about where they're from, a little bit about what they're excited about in terms of the future, given that this conference is entitled Refresh. We're thinking about moving forward boldly and with confidence, and also that they're willing, maybe about 25 minutes into my keynote, to have me ask them directly what's resonating for them. So that's just a way of us making sure that we can be in conversation with each other and not just that I'm a talking head. Now, my 23-year-old son said to me last night, Dad, you do realize you're an analog guy in a digital world, and it is now technologically official. He's right. Nevertheless, we want to try and make this a conversation and make this as interactive as possible. I see this very much as my chance to cheer you on and to honor the great work that you do. So just by way of setting the scene before I invite some kind people to say who they are and what's alive for them in the room at the moment, a couple of things that frame my comments this morning. The first is this idea that the public sector, and it means different things in different parts of the world, but what I mean in real terms is government, local, federal, central government, is largely of a size where it is too big to be helpful in an awful lot of instances. And without the support of folks like yourself who can act and hold that space between the citizenry in local communities and the public sector, I really don't think that we can have a strong civil society, or even, to be honest with you, a strong society at all, let alone an economy. So I think the role you play is absolutely vital. And around the world, we've been seeing this over and over again. You know, I do a lot of work, as you may know, in Europe, and some of the biggest institutions that I know of, second maybe even to the Chinese Army, are in the UK. The NHS, the National Health Service, is a case in point, employs millions of people in different ways, directly and indirectly. And it's interesting that past a certain scale, even though those kinds of organizations are absolutely vital to the health of people in the UK, they can't actually do an awful lot of the things that are essential for health. And one of the things that I've come to realize is that very large institutions have a way of producing antibodies that kill off innovation if they try and do it themselves. So the very smart institutions have learned how to work in real partnership with what they call the third sector in Europe. And I just want to talk a little bit about that and what that might actually look like in practice. So this morning, a lot of what I want to share with you is this idea that if we actually understand the role of the people who occupy the gap between the big institutional world and citizens, what we might actually do is not alone make better civil society, but actually make a better life for people who are most pushed to the margins. Now, before I go any further, could I ask for 3 volunteers to put up their hands and indicate that they'd be willing just to say a little bit about where they're from and what they're hopeful about in terms of the theme of this morning's conference, which is about looking positively to the future with a fresh and an audacious attitude. So could we get 3 volunteers who might be kind enough to briefly introduce themselves, say where they're from, and what's giving them hope at the moment?
So we have Eric from Frank in Kwinana.
Sorry, am I
We have Eric.
Erin, female.
Erin, my apologies. I'm hearing you from a very great distance. Erin, the floor is yours.
Oh, hello. So I come from Frank Konechny Community Centre. My suburb, Kwinana, is basically an industrial hub. I've got a lot of blue-collar workers. We've also got a very high score on the CIFA scale, so there's a lot of social economic issues, and we've also got a large elderly population. So the main things we are trying to do and focus on are overcoming social isolation and just bringing together our community at a grassroots level. What I think I'm most excited about coming into the future is the fact that we have the opportunity to actually engage with people. My job's the community liaison officer, so I get to walk into a supermarket or a park and find someone and sit next to them and go, hello, what's your problem? How are you? What do you want to do? How can we make your future brighter in the suburb that I live in? So it gives me a lot of opportunities to come up with crazy fun ideas and then make them happen. I guess, for example, next week I will be concreting a bench because I got a grant and I want a hard space that we're going to upgrade so we can do things like recycling and gardening and those bits and pieces, which means that my construction clothes are coming out and I've got a youth group and I'm going to show them how to concrete and build a bench.
Thanks, Erin. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Angie from Albany, Rainbow Coast.
Hiya.
Hi.
I'm from Rainbow Coast Neighbourhood Centre in Albany, and we support a diverse group. We're regional, so we're right down the south coast, and we see people not just from Albany, but we mix with communities right throughout the region, and that from elderly to people who are into sustainability to migrants, newly arrived refugees, so children, young families. We're very lucky to work in an environment where we work truly collaboratively with other organisations within our same premises, and that I think excites me the most in the future is how we can, not just as our organisation, but within our region, how we can work more collaboratively, and not just collaboratively with other organisations, but within our community. And I think from our perspective, we've kind of always been working in this semi-top-down. We work very grassroots, but I'm really excited about the fact that we will be able to talk more, hopefully, with our community, to listen to what they're saying and deliver and help them achieve their goals, rather than us coming to them with solutions for problems. So that's kind of we've been working grassroots, but it's a new way of thinking. Well, not new, but we're kind of strategically heading in a different direction, and I think that's quite exciting for our region, and it's been becoming more recognised within higher circles, so within our government departments, and I think that's a really exciting shift that we've seen too. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Angie.
Yep.
Sorry, it's Shiro. That's okay. I've just taken over the General Manager role at the Walpole CRC, so I'm very excited about the whole role. So Walpole is well away from everywhere else. The CRC holds the bank. It has the local community newspaper, which is the only one in the area. And I see our CRC and volunteers as doing an incredible job, and I'm so excited about just expanding those ideas that they're doing well already and making them bigger and making the CRC more sustainable, and furthering the good work that they're already doing, and finding out exactly what they're doing. It's an amazing place.
That's fantastic. Can you say your name again? I didn't catch your name at the beginning.
Sheree.
Sheree.
It's an You can call me
Sheree.
if you want.
Thank you. Fantastic. So Erin, Angie and Sheree, I'm going to ask you in a little while to just say a few words about what's resonating, if anything at all, for you. I'm sure some, at least, of what I say will resonate for you. So just if you can help us with that, probably in about, let's see, we'll see how we go, but probably in somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes time, I'll check back in with you, if that's okay. Let's just go back to the slideshow again, and hopefully the technology will work for us. Or maybe not. There we go. Can you see that? All good? Good. So what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about these 8 touchstones. And really, the reason I want to do this is because I think it's critical that we talk in very practical terms about what it looks like when we reverse what seems to be quite a common trend around the world. Let me say that I think the common trend is this. I think that citizenship and the role of citizenship around the world is being defined as that which happens after the important work of professionals is done. And I think that what we need to do is turn that on its head and say that, in fact, it should be the opposite. The role of professionals and institutions should be defined as that which happens after the important role of citizenship work is done. So in other words, in a democracy, it's grassroots, it's bottom up, and the inventiveness comes from the citizens, from communities. And our job, I suppose, in whether we're occupying the gap between very big institutions and communities, or indeed even I think if there are people in the audience that are friends of ours in the institutional world and are commissioning services or are developing policy, I would say whatever role we play in the institutional life of the people we serve, I think it's not to be the inventors. I loved what Angie was saying about our role is not to come up with the ideas, but to support people on the ground, come up with the ideas themselves, and how we can do that in a way that's sustainable over time, but also includes people who maybe traditionally have been pushed to the margins, even by their own communities. So these 8 touchstones are a way of framing what we're essentially seeing people doing on the, I suppose, at the grassroots level in communities, but also what we're seeing practitioners do to help those people, those citizens in communities. We have an awful lot of experience around a lot of different countries, including in the UK. And I suppose one of the things that's come very much close to my heart is this belief that you get a lot more interesting learning opportunities if you actually go into communities and do the work there. So I love Erin's point around, you know, getting on the overalls next week and actually being out in a community, whether it's doing something around a bench or something more practically around connecting people in some other way. I think those kinds of practical actions are all at once the way that we connect people into community life, and at the same time probably so normal and so natural that they tend not to be valued very much. So what we try to do is create learning sites in Australia, in the UK, in Singapore, and in other parts of the world that demonstrate the power of community development when it's done well. Those practical actions that enable people who are disconnected to get reconnected, or indeed even people who are connected to broaden their circles of participation. And we're doing that work because I think effectively we have an awful lot of theory. We have a lot of stuff written in books. But I believe that the really challenging part isn't writing or theoretically framing community development, but it's practicing it. If you want to change practice, you've got to practice change. And so I think these 8 touchstones are a way of talking about the practice. In a sense, this presentation is a report out of what we're seeing communities and practitioners do on the ground when they become powerful together. One of the health warnings I always put around these observations is that community development, or community building, as I prefer to call it, is not a model. So you can't neatly package it. It's not a set of stepping stones as you see here in the image. It's much more messy. And I think that's been one of the problems for a lot of policymakers and for funders in the past. It's very, very hard to be efficient and measurable and scalable around messy. And so a lot of the time we'll hear policymakers talk about the models that they prefer, and they'll say things like, well, we've got to be able to scale them up. Well, the truth is, when we're doing effective community work, you can't scale it up because it's not standardizable. And typically, what is scalable is standardizable. So the truth of the matter is when you've seen one community, you've seen one community. Even in the introduction, the 3 individuals who introduced themselves gave us a different flavor, a different sentiment to the very brief introductions that they gave us around where they're from and the places they serve and they live in. And I think that's essential to hold on to. So one of the things that I think it's important to say about this work in refreshing our thinking as we move forward is to say that I don't think we can get engaged in conversations about standardization or scaling. I think we have to be saying to those who support the work that if you want to support the work, you've got to get particular. One of the challenges with this work is that we have very large institutions that know everything in general and nothing in particular. And we've got communities that know everything in particular and aren't all that worried about the generalizations that maybe policymakers and funders make. And it's a difficult one because as a policymaker, you have to be able to bring things to everybody. So I want to propose a different way of thinking. And instead of talking about scaling up things that are standardizable, I think what we should be trying to do is proliferate things that are particular to local context and create what I would call mass localism. The way to create mass localism is to work with organizations like yours. CRCs have this wonderful ability to enable governments, federal and central governments, get really local and create what I call a mass local movement. A movement that's able to include everybody across very, very wide territories, but at the same time allow a very, very local expression, which may be different in every place. So one of the great beauties, I think, of doing good community building work is it gives people the opportunity to be masters of their own destiny. But as I say, the trade-off here is that's messy. You don't get to standardize it. It isn't easy to measure, but if it's done well, it actually causes democracy to flourish. So I suppose in that sense it's not simple, and nor is it a science. I think it's complex. It's a bit like raising children, but it's a complexity worth engaging in. And I often feel that the whole process of doing good community work on the ground, even though it's complex, is also authentic. It's authentic in the sense that we're saying to people, we actually care enough to come alongside you as close to your doorstep as possible and enable you and your neighbours connect together at a really hyper-local scale. And I think doing that is one of the ways that we can actually over time begin to help people who become maybe very disconnected and very atomized to become connected. I often joke, and I know you've probably heard me say this before, those who've heard me speak, that I think a lot of folks living in neighbourhoods, in modern neighbourhoods, are more likely to be watching an episode of Neighbours or Friends than making friends with their neighbours. So there's a huge amount of disconnection, a huge amount of atomization going on. And I think one of the great challenges that faces organizations like CRCs, but also I think bigger organizations, is not how do we get more people into our services, but how do we support more people to be interdependent in community life. Now, in the past, I think what we've done with people who have had labels or complex conditions is we've tried to take them out of the institutional world and put them into what we call independent living. But in the process of doing it, what we failed to realize was that independent living actually became lonely living because they didn't have any friends or connections in the neighborhoods that they were actually sent to live in. And I think one of the challenges is not alone working with existing indigenous communities to help them connect, but also how do we support people who've been marginalized or institutionalized to get out of those institutions and instead of being independent, to be interdependent at the center of community life. You know, one of the great measures, I believe, of whether or not we've really supported somebody who's been marginalized to become interdependent is, will they be missed on the days they don't show up for an activity? The big question always in my mind around this work, therefore, is, are we supporting people to be in reciprocal relationships where they're actually being recognized for their gifts and their capacities and not just their needs and their deficits? So the big shift is the shift away from seeing people as needy to seeing people as needed. And sometimes that means actually supporting people themselves to see themselves as somebody and as needed. One of the ways of working at community level is to, first of all, just commit to that idea. We live in a world, and maybe it's different where you're from, but a lot of the places that I visit, I think, are places where we see change in terms of either behavior change or lifestyle change, trying to change the individual. Or else we see change as about reforming our institutions. But I really think that change is about supporting people to have a good life where they live, connected to their economy, connected to their culture, connected to each other, and connected to their environment. And I suppose for me that change then is about shifting away from this idea of seeing the individual as a unit of change or the institution as a unit of change, and instead seeing the village or the town or the neighborhood, the small place, as the unit of change. So in a sense, what I'm saying in this presentation is I think if we're interested in building small places to become vibrant communities, and by community I mean that community is a verb, not a noun. It's not something you point to, it's something you do. So we do community, we don't talk about it. So as a verb, I want to start by saying, I think one of the critical touchstones, as opposed to stepping stones, one of the critical touchstones to building a vibrant community, which is a good inclusive culture, is beginning to find a circle of connectors. Traditionally, I suppose what we've tried to do around the world is to find leaders And I think leaders are important, but what I believe, I've really come to believe very firmly by just seeing it happen all over the world, is that when we invite people who are really good relationship builders to actually be at the center of a movement for growing small town change, it's much more vibrant and much more sustainable over time than just inviting a set of leaders. And I just want to make a distinction here. I'm not in any way being critical of leaders. I think we need leaders. You see on this slide, I kind of talk about the various protagonists in community life and on that stage. So leaders are important because I think they can set agendas and they can bring people on a journey, and that's important. Especially the best of them can really help people feel that they've co-created that journey. But we also have other players in community life, people who will never show up in leadership positions, but they're prepared to contribute their gifts. I am really struck by how in our communities we have abundance of hospitality, abundance of gifts to give, and abundance of associational life. But the irony is that so many of our small places, though they have abundance, in those three areas of hospitality, gift giving, and associational life, often the very thing which is abundant is most invisible. So I think part of the role of a CRC and of you as practitioners is to make the invisible visible, to enable all of the people in those local places to share their gifts and to see themselves as having gifts to give, however small. And that's why it's so important that we don't just make the invite about, will you come and volunteer? Volunteering is a very important way of showing up in civic life. But if we make it the only way to show up in civic life, then a lot of people who are not interested in volunteering but would mow their neighbour's lawn won't show up, or at least they won't show up in terms of how we see them. So as well as inviting leaders into the party and volunteers into the party, we have to find a way of having other calls, having other invites that invite people who may be prepared to give their gifts in other ways, maybe less formal ways. I think we also have people who've been rendered invisible because they've been given various labels. And one of the challenges with labeling people by their homelessness or their disability or whatever the label might be is that often unintentionally labels cause us not to see the gifts of the person, but instead to see their deficits. So one of the challenges, I think, going forwards, one of the fresh perspectives that I think we could have before us is how do we actively lift off the labels that have defined people out of community life and define them into service land? And how do we actually reverse that trend and start redefining people back into community life, not for their labels, but for their gifts, for the contributions they have, because there's nobody whose gift is not needed in a community that has a place for everybody. And I think the people who are particularly good at that, as well as yourselves as practitioners, are the people that I call community connectors. And I think the reason that they're good at that is because they have this ability to bring people into relationship. In every single small place, populations ranging from 200 to 2,000 and 5,000 and above, there are people who live at street level who have the ability to bring their neighbours into relationship. And what I love about them is when they make those connections between their neighbours, they're able to get out of the way of those relationships. So not like many networkers, they don't hold the relationship, they don't refer to the relationships as my network. They're just very happy to find what people are good at and say, you know what, I think you'd really get on with Angie. I'm going to introduce you guys together. And before you even know it, you're connected to them. So I think one of the really early starting points of community building is finding those connectors and inviting them into relationship with each other. It's hard sometimes, you know, just on a citizen level to do this work. I have seen places around the world where connectors have stepped up and they've organized their towns. I've seen it in the transition town movement. I've seen it very, very vibrantly in places I've visited in the Pilbara. I've seen it in Perth. I've seen it all over Australia, where you begin to see how when local people realize if we don't do it, it won't get done. In all kinds of ways, they organize things and make things happen. One of the most impressive movements that I've seen in a long time is the community banking movement, and Bendigo banks now, community banks, are an expression, one expression of that all over Australia. So we've seen how communities can mobilize, often with very little resource. But Touchstone 2 is about looking at how we get the balance between leaving communities without any resource, which I think is just abandoning them. And we've seen some governments hijack community development language around the world and asset-based language and say, oh, well, if communities have assets, let's just take all the services away from them and let them figure it out for themselves. And of course, that's not what we're saying. The measure of a good government is that the communities it serves are more abundant, not more abandoned. And therefore, there needs to be a way of supporting communities. Communities are not just going to spontaneously combust into being more economically vibrant and more connected. But the challenge is, if we're not going to abandon them and we're not going to parachute top-down, heavy-handed solutions in, what's the middle ground? What's the intermediary space? And I think you occupy the intermediary space. You are what I would call the light touch support, which is present and rooted and embedded in communities. And a way of thinking about this is to think about yourselves as community animators, as people who are not the inventors, but are the supporters of citizen invention. Think about it like this, you know, the way Batman and Robin kind of team up with each other. Robin is the sidekick. I think that CRCs are the sidekick to local communities. They're not the superheroes. The communities are the Batman. We are the Robin. We take the slaps sometimes. We have to do a lot of the preparatory work. So we're the caddies. The communities are the golfers. But I think what's exciting about that is that that process of serving while walking backwards create space for citizens, often citizens who don't necessarily see themselves as having a huge amount of power or even a sense of their own collective agency, beginning to really experience that civic muscle. So over and over again, I've seen that community animators, and I know you may have different language, you might call them community builders or some other such language. I don't think the language matters. I think it's the function that matters. And this idea of animating, of facilitating, of cheering on, but never doing for people what they can do for themselves, I think is such a critical support. And over again, what we're beginning to realize now is that governments are coming, albeit late, but are coming to this party and are realizing that this is an incredibly important function in society. And if it doesn't get invested in, then all kinds of unintended consequences flow from that lack of investment. In the European context, for example, now between 20 to 40% of people who come to general practitioners, to doctors' surgeries, are not biomedically ill. They're lonely or they're isolated. It's the same in Canada, and I know it's the same in Australia because I checked the statistics before I came on. And those kinds of statistics mean that there is a tsunami of need coming at your healthcare systems, which literally will overrun the system. Now, the only way that you can begin to address that need is obviously not with antidepressants. We shouldn't be medicalizing people who are not biomedically ill. The only way that we can begin to address those needs is by actually looking to what the root cause is. And the root cause is a breakdown of community connection. It's social isolation. And we're not going to solve that by medicalizing it. We're going to solve that by supporting effective community building and supporting communities to do what they do best, which is build community. One of the characteristics of animators is the facilitator role, but I also think it's the role of curiosity and the willingness to go to the edge and include people who've been, for various reasons, pushed to the margins. I often wonder, you know, tomorrow morning if there was a community animator and if we knew all of the connectors in every town, in every village, in every outer estate, in every suburban neighborhood, what would be different? And I think what would be different is our conversations. I think instead of having conversations about how awful everything is, I think we'd be having conversations about how we can use what's strong to address what's wrong. I think we'd be having conversations about what do we have and how can we use what we have to get what we want. I think instead of talking constantly about delivering top-down services or how dissatisfied we are about top-down services, we've moved from delivery to discovery. I think instead of selling people our predefined content, we would be emphasizing contact and connection. And I think if all of those things were in place and those different conversations were happening, we'd change the world. So starting by hosting conversations that instead of doing a needs analysis, actually focus on an asset inventory, I think that's what actually shifts the conversation and creates real bottom-up democracy. You know, even our finest, our best institutions, if they had all the resources that they required and the best people, could still not do an awful lot of the things that only communities can do. So I think the important thing to recognize here is that in the first 3 touchstones, what we're recognizing is that the role of community is essential. But over the last 20, 30 years, that essential role has maybe not been as clear to people as possible. And so some people have become passive, and some people have begun to see themselves as clients of service systems or as ratepayers rather than as citizens. So the first 3 touchstones are very much about how do we support people to journey from being clients to being citizens. And I'm going to stop there and maybe invite Erin to share some thoughts about what's resonating for her at the moment from what I've said. Erin, could I? Thank you.
Oh, am I on? Oh, hello, sorry.
You are.
I took this time. One, by the way, awesome accent. It really helps your delivery. When I was listening to you, I think when you're talking about the individual connection and how every single story, something that's really resonating with me, and I've already spoken to this lady so I know I can share this, is I have a lady called Yvonne. She's come into what is a social craft group that started out as a bunch of 8 women that has blown out to 67 women. A lot of these are ladies that have lost their husbands and were swinging in the wind and weren't sure what to do in our community. And they've all gathered together to the point that they've grown in their own organism that go out on casino bus trips and do all these things together. But this particular lady 6 months ago was chair-bound in her lounge room. Her mental health was at the point that she would not leave the house. And through a social support collaboration organisation, she has actually left the house. This term, every term we have the flexibility that we adapt our program to the needs we find. She's approached us and she's hosting and facilitating her very own community workshop this term. And just when you talk about the growth and the individual stories, that lady and our capacity to be able to adapt and grow with her and connect with her and identify her needs and support her to come to this accomplishment that she is so proud of, that, to be honest, I don't know if half the craft group ladies actually want to make a glass rock necklace, but they've all signed up to support her. It's just, I think, a true example of that kind of level and what our centres do and the ability that we can engage with anyone. The only other thing that really is sticking to me is when you talked about being a social connector. I'd say that's what I am. I was on the board for my community centre for 9 years. I moved into an area and didn't know anybody and went to a play group and fell in love with the community centre and decided I'd help run it and wasn't going to let it close. And then we were going for tender, and as you might be aware, all our funding issues. And the board, I came to a meeting one day and they said, guess what, I think we should employ you. You need to go and connect with all the people in the community and see how we can turn things around. And I really feel that in engaging the community and being given the support and the way that the model works to adapt to what is our specific needs. Like in this room, everybody's needs are so different in their communities. To support and engage and grow together has just been like, I love my job. I think I have the best job that I could ever have. It's amazing and I'm so grateful. But yeah, so awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. That's wonderful. That's great. And I think as well as seeing the gifts of that lady and, you know, her support needs, seeing how she's actually stepping into her civic role as well. So she is becoming somebody who's actually an asset to her wider community. It's so inspiring. Angie, what's resonating for you? What would you like to add to what we heard Erin share?
Gorgeous story, by the way. Thank you. It's nice to hear those stories when you come. We're kind of all seeing them all the time, but to break them down. I guess for me, what's resonating in me is that for a number of years I lived out in a little tiny wheat belt town called Hyden, and it was about 200 people lived there, and there was no local government, so there was a lot of things that weren't addressed and people weren't feel they were being addressed. And I was lucky enough to be part of that community, and there was a huge amount of community action, and it was driven by people in the town. So as you're going through talking about community connectors and animators and leaders, I'm kind of envisaging all these people in these roles, and what I loved is that because people they hadn't had these services all provided around them. They had this, well, we've got to make it work for ourselves attitude. Now I live in Albany, which is a town of 30,000 people, and one of the first things that I noticed when I moved to town was that there was a real lack of sense of community. There was communities in there, but there was a real lack of where are these communities? Who are these communities? Who are our leaders? Our leaders are pretty prominent, but our communities and the people who have got the gifts that aren't seen. And I think that was a really prominent thing that you said to me. And the people who will be missed if they don't turn up. And I kind of think in all of our communities, there's lots of people who wouldn't be missed. And I kind of think our role, my role and our role is really to find those people and find their gifts, because everybody does. And I kind of think from living in Hyden to coming to Albany, how can I see that working in a bigger space? But it's really about breaking down and vibrancy within the small places within Albany, and on the individual level as well. So especially when we're looking at the societal disempowerment, and I kind of think that really strikes me, and how disempowered, and I myself am, you know, and we all have become, because it's all been done for us and we want that quick fix and somebody else is going to fix it for me. So how do I make that societal shift, and how do I contribute to that? Because that's happened over years, that disempowerment. How do we then step up and reverse that and empower people to feel empowered again to make changes in their community? So that's where I'm at.
That's wonderful, Angie. Thank you. Thank you. And I love that piece around, you know, emphasizing the importance of welcoming the stranger at the edge. So it is so easy to form community of like-minded people. But that's not what the work is about. It's about creating permeability around those circles. Every community has an invisible circle. The Ku Klux Klan is a community. But how do we create permeability so that people can get out of those communities as well as get in, and create that welcome for the stranger at the edge? So thank you for that, Angie, and the important emphasis. Sherry, what would you like to add? What's resonating for you?
Hello. Quite a lot. When you're talking about the gift giver and the invisible person, I keep seeing all the volunteers, and we've got volunteers that don't just volunteer for the CRC, but they're volunteering for business after hours, the community garden, the silver chain, you know. And what I find is that if we've got one volunteer, they're probably volunteering for 5 different groups. So when you're talking, it really is resonating. But what I would love to hear maybe a little bit more is examples of how it's worked for you, how you've noticed the gift giver and the invisible person and what you've done for those people. I don't know whether I'm the only one, but examples always work for me, and I can usually use those examples and go, oh yeah, that's Helen, that's Joe, that's Glenda, and we don't have many Freds, so we've mainly got women.
Which is interesting in itself. Yeah, maybe that's a challenge for you. Yeah, good. Thank you. So one of the things that really strikes me as we think about the whole process of making this work practical in action is having a balance between what I would call the applied and the conceptual. So let me just talk a little bit about what this looks like in application. So Sherry was inviting there a practical example, and one of the best examples I know of actually comes from a place in the UK just outside of Birmingham called Hodge Hill. So I'll just tell you a very, very quick story there that I think encapsulates an awful lot of what I've said, and then maybe also share some other touchstones with you that begin to speak to where to from here. So the story goes that about 7 years ago, the Prime Minister of Great Britain started describing certain communities as broken, and started to basically say that they were full of people who were workless, in that they didn't have jobs. Workless sounds very much like worthless if you say it quickly, and I think that maybe that was the implication that people were taking from what was being said. So people felt very shamed and very judged, and actually the national media also got in on the action. So a number of very damaging programs were made, like Benefit Street, and national newspapers probably too generous a description of them, ragmags maybe might be more accurate, started pathologizing these communities and describing them as the sum of all their problems. So one of the places was Hodge Hill, and a national paper covered Hodge Hill and basically started listing the litany of misery, you know. And we do this with our communities, don't we? We insist often that they describe themselves by everything that's wrong so that they can get funding. And then we make them compete with their neighbours so that they get more funding than their neighbours do. And then we wonder why communities are breaking down. And that certainly was happening 7 years ago. Then a guy arrived in, he said he was very interested in working in a different way. So instead of providing top-down services, he wanted to support the building of community. And what he did in practice, Al Barrett was his name, is still his name, he's still around, still works there, was he said, I'm going to take on a community building role, and I'm going to act in an asset-based community development way instead of just focusing on needs and deficits. So he moved into the neighbourhood with his wife and 2 kids, which is important. So he became a near neighbour rather than a salaried stranger. And that's really important. So he moved into the neighbourhood. It's not essential, but it's important in this context. And began the journey of really finding 7 of his local neighbours who were good connectors. And what they did in practice was they actually went out into all the bumping places, the gathering spaces in the neighbourhood, outside the fish and chip shop at 4 a.m., you know, in the morning, talking with the kids. I could do that after this conversation because it'll just be about 4 a.m. in the morning, so I can connect with the neighbourhood kids. I can actually hear some of them from here. I know exactly where they'll be. I think a good community builder always does. I know where some of the men also hang out, and I know you do too, whether it's at the repair cafes or the men's sheds, if you have one. I'm sure many of you do, but not all do. So they went to places where folks actually lived their lives, and instead of trying to host them in their centres, what they did was they said, how about we go out and we figure out how to be good guests in the lives of the people we serve, rather than trying to get them to come and be our guests. And I think that was a really powerful thing to do. So they went and they stood outside the school after the kids were dropped off and they spoke to the 7 or 8 parents that stopped for 15 minutes for a conversation, and so went to the parks, got to know the names of the dog walkers and the dogs, and really started building deep relationships. And the question they asked was, who are the unsung heroes of this neighborhood? Who are the people who are holding this community together? The unsung heroes, meaning those that are not at the front of the room or chairing a meeting, or maybe are not even volunteering yet, but very quietly behind the scenes are connecting everybody together. And so, and I've shared this story with a few of you, so I don't want to linger on it too much, but I think it's a lovely example of what can happen as a very starting early way of engaging with people. They got 93 names, and they went and they spoke with every single one of them in their living rooms, in their kitchen, at their kitchen tables, really just said thank you, told them what their neighbours were saying behind their backs in positive terms. So in a sense, they gave them living obituaries, the kind of positive things that one never hears. They're said at the end when you're dead at your funeral. Really powerful, powerful stuff. And so one of the things that ended up happening there, which was really powerful, was that as well as those 93 people being affirmed, they also were brought into relationship with each other. They were invited to come to a party. And they were asked to bring 4 of their neighbours from their street along. And so Al, if you look at the maths, before he introduced anything, what he did was he created the infrastructure for doing really good, effective community building across the total population of 5,000 people. He knew he couldn't do it on his own. He knew he couldn't do it even with 7 people helping him. But he knew if he and those 7 people were able to find the connectors, that those connectors would bring the rest of the community into relationship. So literally, he started the conversation with 10% of the population in Hodchill of 5,000. They had a party with 500 people in the room. He introduced no content, didn't recruit volunteers, didn't look for leaders. What he did was he emphasized the connection. 7 years on, because he did that early community building stuff so well, they can now reach populations of 5,000 because those connectors know between 80 to 100 people. And that's the real trick. Now, in terms of doing this work and getting to the edge where people, many of whom don't believe they have a valued social role, so they've spent their lives hearing professionals and maybe hearing even other people say, what's the matter with you, instead of what matters to you, is we need to change the questions. We're asking people questions that immediately make them dependent without realizing it because we want to be helpful. What are your needs? Instead of, what would you like to contribute? If 4 of your neighbours helped you, what would you love to do? So I think one of the practical ways, Sherry, that we can begin to really engage with people who maybe even traditionally don't see themselves as having a role is beginning to not play into the old narrative that actually treats them like clients instead of treating them like citizens. I think another thing that's really powerful about, let me just see if I can bring up the slideshow here. It doesn't seem to be wanting to allow me to share. Bear with me a moment, please. It's not allowing me to share. Hang on a second here. Can you see that? Yeah. For some reason it doesn't seem to want to allow me to move on. Okay, let me just talk to it. It's the slideshow doesn't seem to like the idea of moving on at the moment for some reason. I'm not sure why. Let me just speak to this, if I can go on. So one of the things that is really interesting, you can't see it here, it's touchstone 4, is that when we do the work, when you've got a community circle and you've got people who are really prepared to do the animation work and the conversation work, that it isn't just about doing one-to-one work, it's also about going out and really working very closely with all the clubs and the groups. So there are lots and lots of associations, even in very, very small places. My wife, for example, is a member of a book reading club. She's a member of the book reading club for about 17 years, and a bit like Erin's story of the ladies, who are involved in the weaving and whatever, but it's almost like besides the point. I discovered that even though they have had this book reading club for 17 years, they've actually never read any books. So, I mean, I know I've been married long enough to know you don't ask any questions once you discover these things. It's just, it is what it is. But I'm really struck by how many associations are in our communities that don't have a constitution, don't have a secretary, and don't have a chairperson. They're informal associations. And in all kinds of ways, I think a big part of the work of building community life is discovering those associations and helping them to connect. So I think, you know, creating a map of associations that enable us to know what's going on in the communities that we serve and where those communities are at. Can you see that touchstone 4 there, engaging local groups and associations? Yes? Good. I want to show you something really important. Can you see the slide here with the associational life on it? Yeah? This is really critical in my mind. It says there's a lot of writing on it, and I'm happy for you to have these slides. But I would like to gift this to every CRC, and I'd like to recommend that you print it out and you put it on your wall. Because what that is it is a categorization of every potential associational group that could be organized in a small place. Now, you may not have every single one of these, but one of the great challenges would be to actually share this with community and say, how many of these groups do we have in our community? And I think it's really, really interesting when you begin to seriously start mapping out and creating a portrait of those associations. I think often what we find is that there's this huge reservoir of associational life, and no one person knows what it is. Often we create these directories of services where we have these lists of associations, but only the formal ones get listed. So I think it's really exciting to try and figure out what are the informal associations and then invite them to be in relationship with each other. So how do we actually create a conversation where we're actually hearing the voices of the associational life as well as individuals as well? The final couple of touchstones, and I think I can speak practically to this as I come to the last 5 minutes or so, is as well as being in a relationship with associations and individuals, I think it's really important to figure out how we intentionally create opportunities for interactional activity. As we've said throughout this presentation, and Erin, Angie, and Sherry have shared as well, a lot of people are quite disconnected. So how do we, in CRC terms, actually create shareable opportunities, community opportunities that act like an on-ramp for people who maybe are quite disconnected and not very comfortable in community life? I think of Joop in Javastraat in Amsterdam, a guy with agoraphobia and profound levels of autism who was afraid to go out of his house but was passionate about stamp collecting. And as a consequence of his passion around stamp collecting, developed a savant-like understanding of all the different plants around the world. He became connected into community life because he was the guy that looked after people's plants when they went on holidays. So finding ways, very practical ways, that we can ensure that nobody is left on the edge, that everybody's gift is brought into the conversation, but at a level that they feel comfortable to engage in rather than in a prescriptive way. We are seeing over and over again such simple but practical ideas, from inviting people who are passionate about growing things to swap seeds, to also engaging with people who maybe are getting a little bit cautious about some of the more formal ways of engaging. So for example, we know an awful lot of older men who are quite resistant to joining the men's shed because they say it's too formal for them, but will happily create a pop-up repair cafe in the local pub. So it's about figuring out what are people's different thresholds and how can we practically support people like Fred, as it so happens, the guy with the beard and glasses, and John, be in relationship with their neighbours in a way that feels good to them. Final thoughts. All of what we've talked about in those 5 touchstones, I think, enables people to create a vision together, a collective vision of what they want to see in their small place, or even in their larger urban contexts. And I think it enables them to think about that vision in terms of what they themselves can do to create it. So that's the first question of the 3 key questions you'll see on this slide. What can we do ourselves alone? I think this is a really important way of thinking about civic life. What are the things that only citizens can do? Followed by, what is it that citizens can do with a little bit of help from outside? And then finally, what is it that we as citizens want outside agencies to do for us? One of the great challenges to democracy is when we start with the third question and we ignore the first two. If you start with the third question, you will automatically foreclose on civic power, and the institutions will take over and dominate. So it is critical that CRCs enable and facilitate communities to address the first two questions first. And that also we say to our partners, let's give communities the space and the time to do this. So often we expect communities to do this work at the speed of an election cycle or a funding cycle. This work can only be done at the speed of trust. And so as I conclude, I would say it's about action. Community is a verb, not a noun. We've actually got to do the vision as well as talk about it. And we've got to be willing to celebrate. So the thoughts that run throughout this particular keynote address can be summarized in three key shifts. First of all, let's shift from our prescribed content to emphasizing the importance of supporting community contact. The second insight that I would share from around the world, they're not my personal insights, but the second one is shift from a delivery mode to a discovery mode. Start by discovering what's in the community already and lifting that up. And finally, let's start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, so we can enable what's strong to be used to address what's wrong and to make what's strong even stronger still. Thank you.